Hello and welcome as we continue our study of Islam and its history. And today we're going to be looking at the Caliphate and some of the empires that ruled during Islamic history. This is just a brief overview, stretching from the time of Muhammad all the way down to Ataturk in 1924 when the Caliphate was ended. So the Caliphate, who were the different players that ended up ruling the Islamic world? On this first slide here, you will see that the Umayyad Caliphate ruled for about 90 years after they overcame Ali and the Shia. You remember Muawiyah, we looked at that a little bit earlier, established his capital in Damascus. However, it was seen as oppressive. It left Islamic principles, and you can tell from the map there how big it was. It was the fourth largest empire ever in the world. However, when it fell in 750, one of the Umayyads escaped as the Abbasids took over and killed off the Umayyad family, and it relocated to Al-Andalus in Spain, which there was an Umayyad Caliphate there, but it was a much smaller one, because that leads us to the next caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, which ruled from 750 to 1258. And it moved the capital from Damascus over to Baghdad. And this group of people, they were from the uncle of Muhammad, Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib. And it started in Persia, and because it was from Persia and it included more Persian elements, because Persia had been a world empire before, it was more international. And this really led to the golden age of Islam, which many of us here in the West, we somewhat overlook, maybe don't think about that much. But one of the hadith that I'll put up on the screen, as I have a picture there of Mustansiriya University in Baghdad, Iraq. It says, "The ink of a scholar is more holy than the blood of a martyr." Now, if this hadith is legitimate, because people argue, Muslims themselves and Christian scholars argue which hadith are legitimate, but this would make sense that people believe this, because it really led to a golden age in many fields of technology, science, literature, in the Islamic world during the time of the Abbasids. They were very advanced in science. The architecture of the time became much more advanced than what was in Europe. Mathematics, things like algebra, algorithms, anything with alchemy, so chemistry. Business, they were very good at business. At trading, they basically dominated the trade routes, and their business was very developed. Medicine, they actually licensed doctors. They had psychiatric units in their hospitals. They actually developed pharmacies where they actually had the government overlook the pharmacies and regulate whether or not the medicines were being mixed correctly. In Baghdad, they established the House of Wisdom, and in languages they became very proficient. They actually hired interpreters who became very well paid. And they ended up saving ancient Greek, for instance. They helped the Jews save ancient Hebrew as well. And they became very proficient, probably because their empire was so large and encompassed so many languages, that they viewed interpretation as an important endeavor. And also they viewed keeping alive the Greek culture and history and all the knowledge that the Greeks had, because if that, from the hadith, the ink of a scholar is more holy than the blood of a martyr, they were interested in pursuing knowledge and being scholars and accumulating knowledge. Agriculture, they were doing sharecropping, crop rotations. They ended up developing new ways of growing crops, and partly, again, this was because of necessity, since the Islamic empire stretched over a very dry, barren part of the earth. They had to be pretty innovative just to keep crops growing. Also literature, and some of the literature has survived, but they became very proficient and writing, and many Islamic authors at that time served as bridges between the Greek authors and thinkers and philosophers, and which carried over into Europe eventually. In Europe, there was kind of the link between the ancient Greeks and the Renaissance thinkers and scholars of the 15th and 16th centuries. So it's a very interesting period of time. You can look up on the internet just the golden age of Islam, and you can come up with details. For instance, astronomy. They were very good at astronomy because of finding out the direction of Mecca and where to pray to. And they became very skilled at traveling and navigating. And this really created for a vibrant empire during this time. But we're going to look at the Caliphate and the roots of the Caliphate. And to early Muslims, having one caliph, a male, it had to be a male, who embodied unified Muslim political authority was very important. You remember Muhammad had barely died, and they were already discussing who would lead the group. And again, as we've studied in this brief overview of Islam, it was very important for Islamic culture, I mean pre-Islamic culture, to have a sheikh, to have a tribal leader. So they agreed that you needed a caliph. And that was pretty much a consensus amongst the Muslims, but they disagreed on the qualifications of the caliph, the nature and extent of his authority, and the manner and means of his appointment. So they agreed there needed to be one, but they disagreed on almost everything else, and there were different groups, and we'll look at some of them. There was a writer, Ibn al-Muqaffa, that we have his writings, and he was the son of a Persian tax collector. He converted to Islam from Zoroastrianism. And he began during the Abbasid times, because it was incorporating now Persian ideas, and many Persians were getting involved, that the caliph was not an infallible source of religious guidance, but he did have a unique authority. So he wasn't an inspired person in the sense that he was chosen by God, but he had a unique authority. And he wasn't a president that was just completely democratically elected and representing a democracy. So basically, he ended up coming to the conclusion that he was a king, not a prophet or a president. And this was more of a Persian idea, because the Persians, they viewed their ruler as being unassailable and very, very powerful. Well, the Shias obviously disagreed with this development of thought. Although the Abbasids had used the Shias to come into power, they quickly became more Sunni. And Shias obviously believed that Ali was the beginning of the righteous caliphs, and that the previous three, Omar and Uthman and Abu Bakr, were not righteous. And they believe that failure to recognize the household of the Prophet, the Ahl Bayt, was a grievous error or even an apostasy. So each successor would be designated by Allah, by the Ahl Bayt, and they would be called imams. So they said they needed to be in the line of Ali, in the line of Muhammad. But this wasn't a success, and actually Ali's descendants ended up with very little power, and it was a nice ideology, but really didn't influence Islamic thought that much as far as the general consensus of the whole Islamic world. However, Shias realized this, and they began to change their thought. Muhammad al-Baqir and Jafar as-Sadiq, who was Ali's grandson and great-grandson, they abandoned their political aspirations, and they became quietists. They just moved to the side and just believed that they should pursue a pious, quiet life of living in submission, basically, to whoever was chosen to be the caliph. However, they taught that true imams have this ilm, which is a special spiritual knowledge. That's an Arabic word. And it was hidden from mortals. And this ilm was especially instrumental in interpreting the Quran. So the obligation of the followers of the imam to practice taqiyya was which is a concealment of one's true beliefs. So because they had this secret knowledge, if somebody asked them about it, they could conceal it to protect themselves because they were just trying to live peacefully in this new Islamic Sunni, basically, empire. Not all the Shias agreed. They didn't agree that you should hide your true beliefs, that you should stand up and you should fight. And Jafar's uncle, Zayd ibn Ali, he rebelled against the Umayyads. So this was during the time of the Umayyads. And he believed real imams should fight for the leadership of the community, not be quiet and not conceal their beliefs. Well, during the Umayyad reign, which we saw that when the Umayyads came in, they were more imperialistic. They had more of a palace there in Damascus, whereas Ali and the Shias had been nomads, more people of the country, more pious. And the Abbasids, who were from one of the uncles of Muhammad, Abbas was the uncle, and they traced their lineage from him. They preyed on the Shia sympathies in Persia. And their propaganda said, a preferred one from the house of Muhammad has come. So they began to fight against the Umayyads, and they overcame them in 750. And however, they preyed on the Shia's sympathies to get into power, but once they got into power, they realized that the Shias were too zealous and they wanted their people in power. So they actually began to repress the Shia and didn't allow the Shias to come into the majority or to come into ruling the Abbasid Empire. But most Shias still supported the Abbasids and believed in the true imams, that is, having this spiritual knowledge, and especially in interpreting the Quran. One of the branch of Shia Islam that believes that there were 12 true imams, starting with Ali. And this is today 85% of Shia. They believe that there were 12 imams, if you just count from Ali all the way down. And the 12th one was Muhammad al-Mahdi, and he was taken by God. He's in occultation, and he communicated for a while with the rulers there of the Abbasid Empire, but then he stopped, and now he's just in complete hiding, but he will appear with Jesus before the day of judgment. And this is what is called Twelver Shia, which, like I said, the majority of Shia are now today. And here's a picture of all of the righteous 12 caliphs. Now there was a split with them, with the Twelvers. So you have the Twelvers splitting up, and then you have the Ismailis. And basically what they believed, if you want to look it up, you can look it up online. They believed that Jafar's other son, not Musa, but Ismail, was the designated imam. They were very militant. They believed that one should fight for political authority, and they went around the Islamic Empire and did much missionary work, especially in North Africa and India. And this spawned a dynasty known as the Fatimid rulers in North Africa, which ruled Egypt for about 250 years, from 909 to 1171. And these were the Ismailis. They split with the Twelvers. They believed that, again, and we're talking about the Caliphate, it was very important, this line of righteous rulers. So they split with Jafar's children, and they have another line of which they believe was the righteous Caliphate, which these are the Fatimids, if you read anything about them in history. Another group that is worthy to note in history are the Nazaris. And this is where we get the word assassin. They called them the Hashishiyin. And they ruled from the mountain strongholds in Syria and Iran from 1090 to 1256. And what they would do, they would conceal themselves and they would go around and kill opposing political leaders. And they were absolutely devoted to their leaders, and so the Nazari assassins were extremely feared by the nations around there. In fact, when the Mongols came through, this was their main goal, was to get rid of the Nazaris and to basically, as Gibbons, the English historian, put it, do humanity a real favor. And not too many people were sad to see the Nazaris go because of the terror and havoc they created. The Kharijites, we've already talked about them, but again, they bear worth repeating probably because it deals with how the Muslim world viewed the Caliphate. And they originated at the Battle of Siffin, if you remember, with Ali and Muawiyah. And they opposed both Ali and Muawiyah. And they said that you should be able to fight for the righteous caliph. And when Ali wouldn't fight for his right to be the caliph, they got upset with him and left him and were against both of them. They engaged in guerrilla warfare. Again, they were very feared. However, the group splintered. Only the Ibadis survived. And they had been united by two beliefs. Anybody can be caliph, that is, tribal affiliation doesn't matter. And it is the duty of the believers to depose any leader who falls into error. So if the caliph's not a good Muslim, you have a duty as a good Muslim to fight against that unrighteous ruler. As I mentioned before, the Sasanian revival, that is the Persian revival. The early Persian kings had relied on unassailable majesty and absolute powers. And eventually, because the Abbasid Empire had moved the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, closer to Persia, and many Persians had converted, and as one Arab said it, the Persians did without the Arabs for hundreds of years just fine, but we can't deal without, in dealing with an empire very long at all. So we can see the Persian thought really came into the Abbasid Empire, and they ended up adopting the Persian model of the Caliphate. They emphasized justice as the goal of the government. They said people are the flock, and the ruler is a shepherd. And they saw heresy as a direct threat to the unity and stability of the government. So they were very suspect of anybody who didn't hold to the orthodox beliefs of what the scholars, the Islamic scholars, were teaching. And the scholars tended to fight with the people in authority. And basically in the Abbasid Empire, we see that the authorities began to win out, and they became the more absolute, I don't know if dictators you could call them, but absolute monarchs in their empire. And so then they tried to root out, and there were a couple Inquisition-like periods during the Abbasids, and it came from this Persian thought that in order to have a stable government, you shouldn't have any heresy. There was a Al-Mawardi, a certain scholar, and in 1058 he actually wrote a book called Rules of Governance, which we now have, and he used it as an attempt to outline what was obligatory, permissible, and forbidden by the Caliphate. So these were issues in the Islamic world, and people were debating them, and Al-Mawardi, actually it's one good thing about up to this time in the Islamic world, there was freedom of expression. You could express your views on a number of issues, and in fact the different sects would actually have debates over it. And so we see as late as 1058, Al-Mawardi is writing a book in the presence of the caliph about what is permissible, what is forbidden to the Caliphate. He relied on the Hadith, and he was reacting to the sects like the Kharijites and the Shias. And what he was trying to do was heal the schism, because the Islamic world realized that as they allowed this freedom of expression that they were becoming more united. And what was the role of the caliph? Was the caliph to unite everybody? So he suggested this: the rules for election of the caliph must be of the Quraysh. You remember that was Muhammad's tribe. The caliph must be obeyed, and the caliph must meet certain minimal standards of mental and physical fitness. So he was very flexible on the method of electing the caliph, and he wasn't so much concerned about the power of the caliph, but that the principle of the caliph be recognized. And he admits that the work of preserving the legacy of Muhammad is a role of the religious scholars. So he did delineate and say, we have the ulama, which is the religious scholars. They are to preserve the legacy of Muhammad, the interpretation of the Quran, but also there is the principle of the caliph needs to be there, and otherwise, the scholars at that time, they feared tyranny, but they absolutely despised anarchy. And they didn't want anarchy, and he was arguing that you need to have a strong caliph, at least some caliph, and he needs to be obeyed just to keep the order of the Islamic world. So that leads us up to looking at the next part of the lecture, which we'll call Turks, Crusaders, and Mongols. Because this, about the time of al-Mawardi, as the Islamic world is debating what is the role of the caliph, what is the role of the ulama, and they were freely expressing their opinions. And all of a sudden, we see coming on the scene the Seljuk Turks. And they came from Central Asia, and scholars aren't exactly sure why they began to migrate from Central Asia, and they started to go east. And in 1055, Tughril Beg overtook Baghdad, and he delivered the caliphate from the Shia. There was a Shia Buyid family who had controlled it for over a century. So Baghdad was controlled by the Shia at this time, and when the Turks came in, they were Sunnis. They ended up saving Sunni Islam. Now, many of the Turks had been what's called ghulams, and they, and we'll look at that in a minute here. So when the Seljuk Turks came in 1100, they ruled the largest Islamic empire since the unified Abbasid empire. And there was a very famous wazir, or like prime minister, Nizam al-Mulk, which helped them in their ruling, and he wrote books on, again, what was allowed, what the caliph should be doing. But we see that the Turks came in, and you see on this map, you have the Byzantine Empire there with Constantinople, you have the Fatimids, you remember, which are the Ismailis, down in Egypt, but you had the Seljuk Turks ruling basically the Arabian Peninsula, or part of it, and then the whole Middle East stretching over there to Central Asia and India. So where did the Turks come from? Well, many of the Samanid governors in western Iran had hired them as mercenaries. They were known to be good-looking, strong soldiers. And they brought them in to help them fight. And they realized they were so valuable that they started bringing them in mass. And all the rulers started to do it. But then when the Samanid dynasty started to pass, guess who filled in the gap? Well, the Turks actually came into power. And they actually started to consolidate, and the tribes started to band together. But the Seljuk Turks were the strongest, and they actually ended up defeating their main Turkish rivals. So the Turks were fighting Turks, the Ghaznavids, and they based themselves in the city of Nishapur. So the Turks, it's kind of an interesting story. They come in as being mercenaries, as hired soldiers, and they end up basically taking over and end up ruling Islam for close to 800 years. So even though the Seljuk dynasty itself lasted a short time, it signaled two trends. The rise of Sunni Islam, because Shia, like the Buyid family, they had come in and they'd overtaken Baghdad, so Shia Islam was trying to gain the ascendancy, and then the Seljuk Turks came in and basically conquered, if you want to put it that way, Shia Islam and brought in Sunni Islam. And this also marked the beginning of the Turkish domination of the political and military order of Islam. They were also the first Muslims that were going to control the ulama, that is the clerics. So we see that up until that time there had been debate. What happens, you know, here you have the religious scholars, here you have the caliph and the caliphate. How do they relate together? Up until this time, it appears that the ulama had independence. You could have freedom of expression. You could say what you want. But the Turks, little by little, and especially in the Ottoman Empire, ended up taking over basically the ulama and making it an apparatus of the state. The next thing we see also is the rise of Sufism. And Al-Ghazali, who wrote a textbook, explored theology and mysticism. And he believed humans need imam to arrive at truth. You needed somebody to guide you. And he and Al-Qurayshi, were influential in spreading Sufism during the Seljuk reign. Interestingly enough, this was a time when madrasas became influential, the Islamic colleges, and teaching people. And these reflected the growth of the Sunni consensus because the Shia's bid for political supremacy was over. From the time of the Buyids in about 1000 AD, and when in the Abbasid Empire, there was still, because the Abbasids had preyed on the Shia empathies, there was still this battle for supremacy. But up after this, the madrasas basically began to promote Sunni Islam all over the whole empire. And this makes sense, because as religion became more and more bureaucratic and more an apparatus of the state, Sufism, which is more the mystical, emotional, I guess, or experiencing God and pursuing God, there was more of a need for it because it was becoming drier and drier as it became part of the state. So here are a couple graphs that just show the Turkish military and political dominance. So as I mentioned before, the Ghanavids, they were also Turkish, and they ruled this empire for about 200 years, but the Seljuk Turks ended up taking them over, which that's mostly Iran and part of Afghanistan and Pakistan and the other stands of Central Asia. And interestingly enough, the Seljuk Turks, for the first time, defeated the Byzantine army in 1071 at the Battle of Manzikert, and they began to rule Asia Minor. And at Dandanakan, they defeated the Ghaznavids, and they began to rule that part of Iran and Afghanistan and all the way up into the stands of Central Asia. So you can see there on the map, they had quite a large empire starting in about 1071. So as I mentioned before, the Turks, even though they'd been ghulams, that is slave soldiers, they ended up using them as well. In the Abbasid Caliph, Al-Mutasim, he bought 3,000 Turkish slave soldiers in the 9th century AD. And this was pretty easy because the Turkish tribes were actually willing to sell their prisoners of war, and the slaves would have single loyalty to the caliphs who would provide for their needs. And we see even in Egypt, the son of a slave established his own rules. The Ghaznavids, who we just mentioned, they were also former slaves. And the Mamluks of Egypt also use this practice greatly. That is, you bring somebody in, they're a slave, they're dependent on you, they're loyal, they fight for you. But as I mentioned before, the odd twist of fate is that the Turks ended up becoming rulers because of this interesting phenomenon of slave soldiers. But before we get to the Ottoman Empire, let's look at the Crusades. The Crusades we know more about in the West because this was a first pan-European movement that had enormous ramifications for all of Europe and the papacy especially. And it was to take back the Holy Land from the infidels. Now when they came in to the Islamic Empire, the Turks called them the Farange, or the Franks, because it was mainly a French army. And interestingly enough, they don't call into question their motives from the literature we have documenting it. But what they do call them into question for was how barbaric they were. The Europeans, to the Muslim authors of this time period, were just a bunch of uncivilized, uncouth barbarians invading them. On the way to Jerusalem, and they bring this up, the Crusaders would promise amnesty to the towns, and then they would massacre the whole towns. When they entered Jerusalem in 1099, they indiscriminately massacred the residents, Jews, women, children, Muslims, men, women, it didn't matter. In fact, some Jews holed up in the synagogue and they burned them alive. And at the end of the day, as the blood was flowing in Jerusalem, they knelt down and thanked Jesus for this great victory over the infidels. The Crusades had come at an opportune time for them. The Seljuks were preoccupied with their own problems. In the east, they had the Fatimids in Egypt. They had the Ismailis who were there fighting, and then just own internal fighting amongst the different Turkish factions. So really the Crusades had a pretty easy time overcoming them. However, this probably helped to save the Islamic Empire because it actually began to unite them as they had a common enemy now. The Turkish response, though, really when they looked at it, they weren't overly concerned. They were somewhat resigned to their fate. They could somewhat see it was because they weren't very united. There is an interesting Usama ibn Munqidh. He was amused at the boorishness of the Faranj and enraged by their barbarity. And really in his writings he has an air of cultural and religious superiority. In fact, he has accounts of the Faranj actually adapting to Islam and actually beginning to pray in the same direction that they did. And overall they just viewed this as somewhat a minor irritation that they were having to deal with because they were not united. As historians tell us, it was Saladin that united the Muslims who'd usually been fighting amongst themselves. And in 1187 he was victorious at the Battle of Hittin, which was a turning point, and the Christians launched the Third Crusade. However, Saladin was able to retake Jerusalem, most of the Holy Land, and ever after that, even though there were more crusades, they were never that successful. And in fact, one of them, they just ended up ransacking their Christian brothers in Constantinople and didn't even make it to the Holy Land. So the Crusaders, they lived in the Holy Land for almost 2 centuries, and they actually took away much in the way of language, culture, science to Europe. But really, other than a few castles, they left a very small legacy. And in 1291, at the fall of Acre, it was the last battle in the Crusades, and the era of the Crusades was over. Which this era leads into the era of the Mongols, which will be the last group we'll look at in this presentation. 1218, a governor of Khwarazm Shah, a Muslim state in present-day Uzbekistan, he rounded up a party of 450 Muslim merchants from Mongol territory and had them killed. Well, Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan as we call him in the West, he sent 3 envoys to demand reparation for their deaths. And one of the envoys was killed, and 2 were sent back with their beard shaved, which was an incredible insult. So Khan attacked them for revenge of this in 1219 and pillaged and terrorized Khwarazm, which you have to wonder what that governor was thinking, because the Mongols were known to be a violent people. And what they did, they massacred whole villages, women, children. They would do incredibly vicious things to them in hopes that rumors would spread to the next village or next town, and the next village would surrender. And if they would surrender, they would not touch them. But if you killed a Mongol, watch out, the Mongols were going to revenge the death of any of their fellow Mongols. The Mongol mentality was, they were nomadic shepherds, and they treated all nations as their flocks. And which really spread an empire, because you just go from one flock to the next flock, and if you are the shepherd and all these people are just there to be your flocks, you become you exist to get more flocks, basically. And their culture was thoroughly militarized. Every man was a warrior, so the army became the most important institution in Mongol culture, because they were nomads. And if you were a warrior, which everyone was a warrior, what do warriors do? Well, you go and fight for the tribe, and if your mentality is, their worldview was all these other nations of the world are just flocks waiting for us to be their shepherds, it just kind of led into more and more conquests. They had horses. They were very mobile. Their armies could travel 50 to 70 miles per day, which is quite amazing if you think about how quickly they could move, which would make sense why they were able to surprise so many nations. After the Mongol invasion into Khorasan in 1220 and 1221, Muslim lands were spared for 3 decades because the Mongols were busy elsewhere, mainly in China and elsewhere in Asia. But after Chinggis Khan died and Ogedei took over, and Ogedei died, then there was a leader called Monk, and he sent armies to the Middle East with three goals: to suppress the Nizari Ismaili assassins, which we've already talked about, to suppress the Caliph in Baghdad, and to establish his own kingdom there. Everywhere they went, they were successful. Actually, I'm sorry, even before that, they'd invaded Russia and had a lot of success in Russia, were very violent to the Russians. And when they sacked Baghdad, they killed 200,000 people. So it was a very violent overtaking of the capital of the Abbasid Empire, and this marks the end of the Abbasid Empire. In fact, the Mongols were only stopped by a Mamluk victory, surprisingly enough, down by Egypt, and they were repulsed and sent back towards Mongolia. But the Mongols, although they ended up with one of the largest empires in the history of humanity, they were probably they had more of a psychological impact than a realistic impact in real life. Much of the Islamic culture was lost in these raids. Libraries, the mosques, the hospitals, they were destroyed. For instance, agriculture in Iran. Iran was especially, or Persia at that time, was especially impaired. Canals, wells were destroyed. As I remember the story, on this occasion too, one of the rulers of the Mongols had sent an envoy to Persia. And again, they killed one of the envoys, sent him back, and the Mongols came, and in getting revenge for the death of their envoy, they killed up to 1 million people in Iran, and it took Persia, according to historians, about 100 years to recover from this defeat. So the brutality of the Mongols is debated, but how many millions? And probably the numbers are inflated. The Islamic and the other historians, probably the Russian and Chinese historians gave. But really, to haggle over numbers kind of misses the point. The point was the Mongols had a very strong influence on the psychology of the people groups there, because they were so violent, so fast, that people didn't want to mess with them. What's interesting, though, to Islam is that they were very similar to the Arabs. That is, they were both nomadic peoples. They were both basically shepherds. They had kind of that same mindset. They both had incredible conquests. The original Islamic Arab conquests were very similar to the Mongol conquests. But what's interesting, though, is that the Mongols adopted Islam eventually. So about 100 years after Genghis Khan, they ended up themselves becoming Muslims. Whereas the Arabs, wherever they had gone, they had not adopted the local religion. They had retained their own religion, the worship of the one God in Islam. So the Mongols basically destroyed the Caliphate, which is how we started this lecture and which is why we come to this. But Islam survived. For instance, if you've ever heard of Rumi, Jalal ad-Din Rumi, a very famous Persian poet, he wrote during this time period. That is, they couldn't destroy Islam completely. Islam was resilient. Islam was going to make it. But the Mongols put it to the test. And from 1258 on, there was no Abbasid Empire. The Umayyad and Abbasid empires had moved off, which will leave us for the next time when we study the Ottomans, because the Ottomans are another interesting time period, which start right after the Mongols had left, because the Mongols didn't last for more than a couple hundred years, and then the Mongols kind of faded off the scene as well. So I hope you enjoyed this section, and next time we'll get into looking at the Ottoman Empire.